Welcome to the Glucose Never Lies podcast. I'm John Pemberton, a dad, a husband, a diabetes dietitian, a researcher, and someone who has lived with type 1 diabetes since 2008. Now, this podcast is my way of giving back. When my son Jude tested positive for type 1 diabetes antibodies, everything changed. I knew that I had to act quickly and create a resource that was both comprehensive and easy to understand for anyone who was going to support Jude. That's how the Glucose Never Lies started, an education platform to support my son's future care. Now, fortunately, his confirmatory test came back negative, but this doesn't rule him or my daughter Grace out for the future. And since I was diagnosed at 27, I know it can happen at any time. The last 2 years have been the hardest of my life. I've been battling depression, a functional motor disorder, and after finally receiving an ADHD diagnosis, my journey back to health was only made possible by incredible support from my family, my friends, and the wider diabetes community. And really, that experience has taught me the power of giving, and that written guidelines work for some people, but podcasts bring things to life in a real and relatable way. So that's why I've started this podcast, to make diabetes management engaging, practical, and hopefully a lot of fun. Now, I've been fortunate to work alongside some of the world's leading researchers and thought leaders in type 1 diabetes, and I bring them onto the show so they can share their research, their stories, and their innovations. So you're going to also hear from people with type 1 diabetes who are doing amazing things, such as advocates, clinicians, and people who are shaping the future of diabetes care. Within this podcast, you're going to hear reflections and conversations on everything from partying with type 1 diabetes, the latest continuous glucose monitors, automated insulin delivery systems, adjunctive therapies such as GLP-1s, nutrition, exercise, insulin resistance, and childhood diabetes care, and much, much more. But I want to be clear that this podcast is for educational and informational purposes only. I do not know you. I do not have skin in your game. I only have skin in my game and my family's game. So this is for informational purposes only. It's very important. So please always consult your healthcare team before thinking about making any changes to your plan. So that done, I'm glad you're here. Let's get started. Welcome to the Glucose Never Lies podcast, episode number 16, which is Driving with Type 1 Diabetes with none other than Professor Pratik Choudhary. Now, within this session, what we're going to cover is what the current guidance is for Group 1 and Group 2 drivers in the UK. We're going to discuss why the risk is assigned what it is compared to things such as alcohol and sleep deprivation. And then we're going to get into the specifics. What are the rules around driving? What do we need to know? And then we move further on into what do people with type 1 diabetes need to know exactly and how they should have discussions with their healthcare team. And then we move on to what healthcare professionals should know. What questions should they be asking? What data should they be looking at? What is it they need to know to support the people with type 1 diabetes and not be oversensitive to overnight hypoglycemia, for example, which has been a thing of the past? And then finally, we move on to kind of the key 4 things for both people with diabetes and healthcare professionals to support basically driving safely with type 1 diabetes. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. It was certainly one that I enjoyed very much. Pratik is an absolute legend. So without further ado, let's get into the show. Welcome to episode 16 of the Glucose Never Lies podcast, which is Driving with Type 1 Diabetes. And I am honoured today to be with Professor Pratik Choudhary. Welcome, Pratik.
Hi, John. Pleasure to be here.
Good. So just to give you a bit of background on Pratik, he is a professor of type 1 diabetes and technology at the University of Leicester and Leicester Diabetes Centre, a post which is fairly new to him after working at King's for a long period of time. He's been involved in many groups for people with type 1 diabetes, Daphne, ex-chair of the DTN network, I believe associate editor of diabetic medicine as well. And then most importantly for this discussion, he is the chair of the DVLA Medical Advisory Panel on Diabetes. And that's really where this discussion came, because Pratik asked me to be involved from a CGM perspective to give some ideas around safety of driving. And I thought at that point, not many people with type 1 diabetes know the level of detail around driving that we possibly need to. So there's the official introduction, but the better introduction in some ways for me is I really met Pratik about 2010 when I was working at Salford at a Dexcom event, and I thought, who is this guy with all this energy? It's quite intimidating, you know, all this stuff, and you kind of sat there thinking, wow, like I don't really know how to ask a question, but as I've got to know Pratik over time, he's been extremely nice, warm, humble. He's been involved with the CGM accuracy paper that we did a while ago. And most importantly, he's just really interested in technology, new ideas, and his energy is all based around that. So that's kind of really the proper introduction. So welcome to the show, Pratik.
Thank you. That's so kind. They're a pleasure to be here. And yeah, and likewise, when we met you again, it's the intensity and passion, is it, that kind of pulls people together, and that's really what's fun.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think really in terms of setting the scene for today, when I was involved within that working group on the sort of the DVLA, it really, a few things struck me. Number one, there was a clear understanding around how much hypoglycemia impacts the risk of driving, which we'll discuss, and we'll just kind of go through that. The sort of complexity of the rules between group 1, group 2, CGM versus blood glucose, how long you have to wait, how long you have to check. And then again, trying to boil that down into simple, understandable nuggets that people with type 1 diabetes can take action on, but equally as importantly, healthcare professionals who are supporting people driving, how can they educate them the right way? And also, are they being over-penalising around hypoglycemia when it comes to driving? So my hope is by the end of this discussion, we'll touch on all those topics and hopefully provide some pretty clear guidance, etc., for people with type 1 diabetes and clinicians supporting those people with type 1 diabetes. So I guess the key thing to start then really is give us an understanding of how these risks are understood and the differences between group 1 and group 2 with regards to the acceptable level of risk.
Okay, so straight in. So let's first of all start out by just figuring out what group 1 and group 2 is, because a lot of people get confused by that. So group 1 is basically all of your regular cars or motorcycles that you might use. And the limit is actually a weight limit. So 3.5 tons is the weight limit for a group 1 vehicle and 8 passengers. So so anything within that on the back of your license, you might be able to see it and it will say group 1, and that's what you're allowed to drive. If you want to drive anything above that, there's a kind of intermediate category called C1 or D1. And C1 is 3.5 tons to 7.5 tons. And often that catches out things like motorhomes, transit vans, and things like that. And then you've got minivans between 9 and 16 passengers. There is a provision that volunteers, so people who might volunteer for Scouts, could actually drive a minivan if it's very occasionally, as long as it's done not for profit or hire.
So my wife does that at school. So she drives the minibus to things. So she would fall into that category, right?
Correct. Yeah. So there's a lot of people actually, I do a lot of group assessments, and some people drive a Scouts or have a motorhome they drive once a year. But because it's above that 3.5 ton level, they need a group 2 license.
Oh, okay.
Interesting, within the eyes of the law, whether you're driving a 32-ton lorry 8 hours a day, or you need that license because you've got a horse box, or you've got a motorhome that you drive down to south of France once a year, it's a group 2 vehicle. You have to fulfill the same criteria.
And that's
once
actually
you've got
really
that weight of vehicle.
That's really important when you're going to come to discuss the differences in level of risk and also what's allowed between the two there. That's actually surprising to me.
Yeah. And so, yeah, a lot of people come and say, look, do I really need this? I just want the license in case when we're driving back from France, if my husband or my wife needs a rest and I want to drive. And, we can't have, I guess there's a pragmatic view of you can't have rules. Well, someone who does a sales job might do 60,000 miles a year in a car and is on the road a lot. Yeah. So because the differentiation here about group 1 and group 2 is basically the difference between risk and hazard, which are two different words. So risk is for that individual, what's the risk of them having an accident that's related to hypoglycemia or having hypo whilst driving? And the hazard is what would be the impact of that event if it would happen. So if you crash your Renault Clio and injure yourself, the risk is much lower there to other people than if you crash a 32-ton lorry. Also, the amount of time a professional driver spends on the road is much greater. So that risk gets multiplied. And that's why you've got the group 2. That's why the rules are different for group 1 and group 2.
That makes total sense. So obviously, I'm just thinking of my nephew has just passed his HGV, and I guess if he had diabetes the same as me, the risk of going hypo is presumably similar. But if I was to crash, obviously my Renault Clio, how do you know I drive that? Then there's very much lower hazard to people and
Correct.
Surroundings compared to a big HGV. So as that hazard goes up, presumably the stipulations get a bit tighter.
Absolutely. And that's why the group 2 regulations are that much tighter than group 1. And group 1 is actually, in reality, quite lenient. the DVLA is actually, when you sit there, you think actually the DVLA is quite lenient.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. So that's group 1 and group 2 clearly understood. So maybe if we talk through group 1, what are the specific rules and the things that people with diabetes have to consider with regards to different types of blood glucose testing, levels for driving, and how long they the time frames of when they're meant to be testing?
So I think the first thing I'll say is a big question that people get back to me is, no one told me these were the rules.
Mm-hmm.
And my response back is, well, when you went for your driving test, did you rely on your mate to tell you if you could stop on a double yellow line or what those boxes with the yellow hashes mean? Or did you read the rules? Right? So ultimately, it's the responsibility of the driver to know what the rules are related to their medical condition. And what I'll say is, in case I forget and make a slight mistake, the place you want to look for is you go to the DVLA website, and there's a whole bunch of information leaflets about medical fitness to drive for different conditions, because people who live with diabetes might also have other conditions as well. So
yeah, I was going to say, I'll put a show to that. I'll put a link to that in the show notes, and on here I'll actually flash up what that website is so people can go, just to get you off the hook.
Yeah. And so that's the first thing. So secondly, if you have diabetes and you're treated by tablets, I think you have to tell the DVLA on your form, but you don't. It doesn't affect your ability to drive for whatever other, even injections people are on, injections like GLP-1 therapists or tablets. You don't have to tell people, but as soon as you go onto insulin, then you have to inform the DVLA that you're on insulin. And for type 1 diabetes, for a group 1 license, that's all you have to do. You have to tell them. And what might happen is, like when I have a license, my license is valid till I'm 70. But if you have type 1 diabetes, its validity is 3 years, and you have to self-declare that you're still fit to drive every 3 years. And a small proportion of those will be sent to a clinician, your own doctor, your GP or your specialist, for confirmation.
It's like a random audit.
Yeah. I think that's the way it works. I think it used to be a much higher percentage, but actually now it's a smaller percentage of those forms will get sent for confirmation.
Sure. Sounds good.
Because ultimately, you're self-declaring that you have awareness, that you check your glucose, that you follow the rules, and you're aware of the rules.
Mm-hmm.
And if you are engaged in an incident and are found not to following those, then that's your responsibility. A bit like you self-declare that I don't drive home from the pub after 6 pints.
Yeah, absolutely.
So for group 2, so for group 1, that's the main rules. So now up till about, I can't remember the year, but probably it's about 2020 or 2021. So it was reviewed in 2015-16 when CGM first came around. At that point, it was thought that there's not enough data on CGM, and it was thought that the CGM devices, certainly around that time, were not accurate enough for driving rules. And that's why when CGM first came out, when Libre first came out, people had to do finger pricks. I was actually then brought into the DVLA panel to give some evidence around the data on hypoglycemia. And I made the argument on 4 criteria. I think the first criteria that I argued on was that if you've got CGM, then in the event of an incident, if you crash your car, there is forensic data. You were low at the time of the crash or you weren't. Number 2, if you're on CGM, overall, your risk of hypoglycemia is about half. So, whatever your risk is, it's going to be halved anyway. And when you are low. The third thing was, there was some lovely data from Jerry Raymond, who's a consultant in Ipswich. And he showed that if you were to do a glucose reading and your sugar's more than 5 before you start, there is about a 20% chance that in the next hour, your sugar would drop down below 5, which you wouldn't be aware of if you're just following the finger prick data. And then finally, we did some analysis looking at the accuracy and said, look, even if using the accuracy data of current sensors, the risk of your sensor saying that you're above 5, but you're really being low, is actually really low. And so on the basis of that, now for your own car, for group 1 licenses, you don't have to do a finger prick, you're allowed to drive. So from a law perspective, it doesn't matter how you measure your glucose, as long as you measure your glucose before you start and you stay above 5 while you're driving.
So that's where obviously at Daphne, everyone's quite happy with 5 to drive. And that 5 to drive doesn't matter whether it's a finger prick, a CGM reading, whatever. Above 5 to drive is good. What about if it's below 5?
So the rulings below 5 are, so a lot of people get the 5 to drive, but what the law actually says is if you're between 4 and 5, and this is really important for people on closed loop or CGM who are running quite tight, right? If you're between 4 and 5, then you're allowed to have a snack and continue. So you don't have to stop if you're between 4 and 5. If you see that you're between 4 and 5, so for example, if you're doing a finger prick before you start and it was 4.8, you can have a snack and off you go. Because the logic there is if you've just eaten something, of course, with a view to bring your sugar up, if you take a big wad of insulin with that, then you're putting yourself at risk, right?
Sure.
You're taking carbs to push your sugar above 5 to make you safe for your driving episode. And with CGM, the same thing, you push it up. If you're below 4 during your drive or before you start driving, then legally you're supposed to wait for, and this is what people get mixed up. People say 40, people kind of remember the 45 minutes. But when I ask them 45 minutes from when, it's actually 45 minutes after your glucose is more than 5 that you're safe to drive.
So that's actually quite a big difference, isn't it? So I just run the scenario that's coming in my head, which has happened to me quite a few times, is I'm about to go and take the kids somewhere, and then I've checked my glucose level, it's 3.8, and essentially I've got to get it from 3.8 to above 5, whether that's on the CGM or the finger prick, which is often a 20-minute job. And then you've got to wait another 45 minutes. So for me, in that case, it would be 1 hour and 5 minutes before I was actually legally safe to drive, which is a big implication because that means that I've got to get my mother-in-law to take them wherever they're going, or we sit in the car together. But that's just, the realities. But I think it's really important to pick out that level of detail because most people just think, oh, I'm above 5, now I'm going to drive. But so just explain why that 45-minute wait is, because people are going, well, that seems like a bit harsh. Why is that the case?
Okay. So number one, so let's look at what actually happens. So people like me and some of my colleagues spend a lot of time making people hypo in the lab. So I just want to make a comment here that with so much information about fall of the floor and hypoglycemia, a lot of people think that if don't differentiate between the risk at a glucose level of 4, 3, or 2, right? And people are, so I just want to do a little sidestep from the driving, but just talk a bit about understanding of hypoglycemia, because I come across a lot of people who are really scared, if I go 4, and you say, well, what's a hypo? It's a glucose below 4. And what happens if you're hypo? They say, well, I'll go unconscious and but as you know, there's a big gradation between 4 down to 2 and a big difference in how that impacts you. So what people like, and a lot of work on this recommendation is based on was done by Professor Mark Evans from Cambridge, and some work done at King's a long time ago. And what we do is we drop people in a very controlled environment. It's called a clamp study. We get your glucose to 3.8, 3.4, 2.8, down to 2.4 for 40 minutes each. And at those levels, at each level, we can do brain function tests that check your decision-making and your reaction time. And these, let's say there's more than 3,000 or 4,000 of these experiments have been done since the late 90s across the world. And they're very, very consistent in showing that nothing much happens to your reaction time or executive function decision-making until you get below 3, right? And when you go below 3, then you start slowing down. And your brain, so you're losing reaction time. Your brain generally makes the right decision. So your brain sacrifices speed for accuracy. So even down to glucose at 2.5, we'll find people are slowing down and making the right decision, but just taking longer. And that, of course, that longer is the difference between you hitting that little kid who jumps out and not, that sort of thing. Sure. So what they found in those experiments was if you'd got someone down to a glucose of 2.8 for 25, 30 minutes, their brain reaction time slowed down. And then when you brought them back up to 5 and you repeated the test, it was 45 minutes later until they got back to their baseline.
So as I'm hearing that, then that 45-minute wait is because they're looking at the worst case scenario that you've potentially been as low as that, and they know within 45 minutes guaranteed that your executive function will be back to a good enough level. It may not take that long, but from a safety perspective from the other drivers, that 45 minutes is important because you're dealing with the worst case scenario. Is that kind of what my
or maybe let's examine, maybe the easy way to, another way to understand this is, let's say you go to the pub and you have a pint of alcohol. You're impaired for an hour and a half or 2 hours until your body's dealt with that. Even though you stop drinking in the pub, it doesn't mean that you're fine. And although you might feel fine, if I may say, let's say I've got a friend, I'm going to use a friend, and I'm a better driver than they. I'm sure that I'm safer after a pint than they are. I might feel that, but I'm not at my level, right?
Yeah, of
And
course.
you drive to your level. So that's the sort of example. It takes you 45 minutes after your sugars normalize for you to get back to your normal level, and that's where that definition that's where it comes from.
Perfect. Yeah, no, that makes sense. So I think a lot of people will be listening going, 45 minutes seems like a long time. But if that's what the laboratory studies show, is that ultimately what we want is people being safe on the roads. And we don't certainly want people with diabetes being involved in an accident and it's, led to then a negative stigma attached to that. We know if we wait the 45 minutes, we're going to be back to normal and therefore we're at the lowest risk. Okay, that makes sense. Perfect. So let's just clarify there. If you're below 4, got a treat, got to get above 5, you've got to then wait 45 minutes, then you're safe to drive. Between 4 and 5, you're good to drive. You just need to take a snack and then you can go.
Yeah, you need to take measures to get yourself above 5.
Yeah.
And so, so the way I kind of explain it is that, you've gone below 4, right? And the thing is, the reason why, as I told you, brain function doesn't really deteriorate unless you get below 3. But given the level of accuracy, as you will know, for most meters, you have to be within 20% of the time. So that if your sugar's 4, there's a 20% chance that you're really close to 3, right? So that's why the level is 4. It gives us that level of safety.
Yeah.
And so, and then you've got to get above 5, check that you're above 5. So there's one check that you're above 5, confirm that you're above 5, and then it's 45 minutes from then.
And then am I right
Check
in
again,
saying,
and then safe to go.
you got to check before you start? Or let's just presume all those conditions are sorted, that you check before you start and then a minimum of every 2 hours as you go along if you're doing a long journey, right?
Yeah, so again, and I'll apologize, the way the form is written is quite, I think, confusing also, because there's something about you've got to check a minimum of 2 hours before. And some people, when they're reciting the rules back to me because they think I'm making a decision on their license, say, I've got to check 2 hours before I drive. And that's the easiest way to explain that is to say, every time you do a check, that's got an expiry of 2 hours, a bit like a parking ticket, right? So once you've seen your glucose, you're good for 2 hours. Now, of course, on some systems, you can tell if the person's up to that glucose, and some systems you can't, right? So I think for people using systems where you can't prove that you've checked, ultimately for you and your family and other road users' sake, you want to try and stay above 5 as much as possible. And if you dip below 5, get out of there quickly. I mean, that's a simple way to talk about it. But
ideally, from a common sense point of view, check before you start, because then you know exactly you're good to go. And then every 2 hours, and if the journey is not going to be more than 2 hours, then you don't need to check again, obviously, unless you feel low and all of those extra bits and pieces. Okay.
Yeah. So people doing recurrent small drives, delivery drivers, but you nip into the shops, picking up the kids. If you've checked, and people, this was all written in the era of finger pricks, right? So once you've done a finger prick, we didn't, if you drove to pick your kid up and then you're driving back home, that's 2 journeys. And then do you need to check again before you come back home? No. There was a pragmatic view taken. If you've done a check and you're over 5, then you're good for the next 2 hours.
And I think what is really interesting what you said here, and this was something that it sort of took me back a little bit when we was in the meeting, is as you just described, if you do a glucose level with a finger prick within the next hour, the risk of being below 5 or being low is actually 20%. So really there's an acceptability of 20% risk of potentially going low. And then that really comes on to the group 2 licenses. What's different between the group 2 licenses? So that's what group 1 we've just explained, which is between 4 and 5, take a snack. Above 5, you're good to go. CGM and blood glucose is absolutely fine. If you're less than 4, you've got to treat the hypo or treat whatever you call it, get above 5 and then wait 45 minutes and then you're good to go. So that's the kind of group 1 for the vast majority of people. Now, group 2, which you've described, which is even your kind of minibus drivers over 8, when they're up to your HGVs plus, what's different for in terms of glucose testing and ranges, etc.?
So the ranges and everything you said about how frequently you need to check and what your levels are is exactly the same, but there are 2 subtle differences. So for some people who don't recognize all of their hypos, for group 1, there is a leniency about letting you drive. So you'll only be banned if you have a complete loss of warning signs, if you can't tell at all. And that's actually a small proportion of people. There's about a third of people who've got blunted warning signs. They don't really feel it all the time. And they might be worried about approaching their medical teams and kind of saying that, I don't quite feel my hypos. the longer you have diabetes, the less your warning signs become. The older you get, the less your warning signs become. And there's an understanding that happens. And the DVLA is actually quite lenient about some people with a slight blunting of warning signs driving. But for group 2, no. Group 2, you need to have full awareness because the risk is much higher. The tolerance of any risk is much lower. And so at the moment, as the law stands, the feeling was that for group 2, they wanted the benefit of the accuracy of the finger prick checking. And so when I assess people, and so every person who wants a group 2 license, so let's say I'm a lorry driver and I'm diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, I'm on tablets, and then, eventually I need insulin and I'm going on to insulin, right? So the moment I go onto insulin, I've got to tell the DVLA I'm on insulin. I shouldn't drive for a month after that.
Mm-hmm.
My HGV vehicle, right?
Okay.
And then I need to make an appointment with an independent assessor. And then the reason why that's an independent assessor is that I'm not your doctor. So if I say, I'm not breaking a patient relationship by saying you're not able to drive, right? I'm making an independent judgment. And so I have to see, and I check 3 things. I check, number 1, does this person check their glucose regularly? Because if you're someone who actually, I see 6 readings in the last 6 weeks, there's less chance that you're going to check religiously when you're driving, right?
Sure.
So does this person check frequently? Number 2, based on those readings, what's my assessment of their risk of hypoglycemia, right? And again, to assess that risk, I need to have a certain number of readings. If you've not done enough readings, then I can't assess that risk. And then thirdly, does this person have an awareness of the rules? Do they know, for example, if they're driving, what to do if they're hypo, when they're safe to drive, when they can restart, how often they need to check, all of those rules. So I check these 3 things, and that gets checked every year.
So the distinction there, group 1, you can have some hypo awareness and blunted to drive, but obviously complete unawareness, that will be a no. And then for group 2, has to be full awareness because of the increased hazard, as you discussed earlier on. Is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
And then what's the situation with the severe nighttime hypoglycemia? Because I know there's a lot of discussion and misunderstanding about this. So as an example, people often say to me, I wouldn't declare that I had a severe hypo overnight because I'll lose my driving license on group 1. And I don't think that's correct, is it?
That's not correct. So, and again, if you come back to, there's a lot of, what at least I find, a lot of misunderstanding or confusion about what we mean by severe hypo or hypo, right? Yeah. So hypoglycemia, we're going to define as anything with a glucose under 4. So technically that's hypos, whether you feel it or not, right? Now, if you have symptoms of hypoglycemia that are at a glucose over 4, it could be that your reader was wrong and you were actually below 4. Or it could be that a lot of people are getting symptoms that they are attributing to hypoglycemia at a higher glucose level. And it's incredibly difficult to differentiate out the anxiety, I might be going hypo, from actually being hypo, right? And that's something that is impossible to tease out. Once you're below 4, it's what we call level 1 hypoglycemia. But I want to make the point that whilst that's for driving, that's a no-no. Outside of driving, I just want to make the point that I make the analogy that it's a bit like, if you have parking sensors on your car and you're reversing in, that's the first beep. It's not that you're not in any major danger, but you're in a situation where you want to reverse the glucose and turn it around and get out of there, right? So you're not going to pull full throttle. You don't want it to go any further, But if you always take your sugar before, then you'd we know that you're going to get between 3 and 4 at some point, and it's not a disaster. Actually, you're at no particular risk at that level, right? Apart from the accuracy of the sensor. So I would say that's the first beep in your parking sensor telling you you're close to danger, but not in danger. Glucose of 3 is where all the harm that could happen to an individual happens. So that's the number that you really want to make sure you don't get below. That's when your brain starts to slow down, inflammatory responses to hypoglycemia that can contribute to an increased risk of heart attacks, heart problems, lots of different things happen at prolonged recurrent readings below 3. That's when I say the parking sensor is going stop now.
That's the red
but
one.
Even then, even then there's a bit of a gap, right? Even then there's a bit of a gap. And I'd say being below 2 for a prolonged period is when you get into really nasty harm. Those are the ones that are harmful. So I just wanted to make that distinction about people who worry about hypos, about, going below 3, the odd occasion doesn't really, that's when you want to stop, but there's still a bit of space there before you run into real danger. And severe hypoglycemia, a lot of people say, oh, I was really symptomatic. I felt terrible. That was a really severe hypo. And of course, for the person living with diabetes, that's their severe hypo. But in medical terminology, legal terminology, severe hypo is one where your brain function is impaired to such a level that you need someone else to help you out. And there's a lot of gray zone there because, John, you're feeling a bit rough. You're just looking a bit pasty, and I'm sure your
with a hangover usually.
And I'm sure someone will pop across and give you some orange juice, and you receive support, but you didn't need it. If you had to, you could probably go and get it, right? But you might be alone and have a nasty hypo and kind of almost lose consciousness, and then the insulin runs out, and your body comes back out again, and no one gave you assistance, but you actually needed it that time. So there's a subtle difference there, and those are the events. So having a sensor glucose, you wake up in the morning and you see that your sensor was flatlined through the night, happens really common. Some of it is sensor artifact, some of it is real. I've had those myself. I don't have diabetes, and I've had a red line at 2.3 the whole night after a night out with you.
Yeah.
So that's not a severe hypo legally, right? So
yeah. So you're thinking more like requiring someone squeeze a glucogel in the mouth, someone requiring a glucagon injection, someone being force-fed, kind of carbs. Ideally, you shouldn't do that with glucogel, but you do what you need to do in those circumstances. But pretty much where you're kind of out of it and making any conscious or pretty decent decision is very different to someone, like you say, feeling shaky, feeling wobbly, but can themselves get to the fridge and whatever and get what needs to be. They might feel terrible, but that's not classifying as a severe hypo.
Severe hypo.
Okay.
And then so severe hypos, so when I started, so 20 years ago, if you had any severe hypos, you were allowed one, and that's a oops, right? It happens, that's fine. But if you have two in a 12-month period, the data tells us that puts you at a much higher risk of having a third one, right? So that's why that's where the two rule comes from. Now, actually, the data doesn't differentiate whether this happened at night or day.
Okay.
Right? But Diabetes UK argued very passionately and made a change and pushed through a change in the rules that said, okay, if those severe hypos happen at night, then you're unlikely to be driving at night. And so that was okay. So we only count severe hypos that happen the day. Again, you're allowed one, but if you have two in a 12-month period, you have to declare to the DVLA that you're unfit to drive. And again, this is a difference. It's not your doctor saying, oh, by the way, I'm banning you from driving. The law says you can't drive. I'm just informing you of the law.
So I think that's really important because there's a lot of people I speak to who would be worried about telling their doctor that they had any severe hypoglycemia when they had. And the reason why that's problematic is obviously if they've had them and they've had one or they've one in the night, whatever, tell your doctor because you may be due for a therapy, maybe an automated insulin delivery system, maybe a change of background insulin, maybe could be anything. Some of the new technologies that are coming, you'll count yourself out of those because you're the person who needs it the most. So as long as you're clear, you can have one with no problem. You can tell your doctor about that, but obviously if you have two, it's a self-declaration. It's important for your own safety, your family's safety, and everyone else's safety to declare that because number one, you can get some help for that. And number two, as you just described there, when you have two or more in a year, you all of a sudden jump and massively increase your risk of having a hypo potentially at the wheel and causing some issues.
Anyone with a severe hypo, generally speaking, if you've had a severe hypo, it's a traumatic experience. It's a horrible experience for the person living with it. And if you go to a healthcare professional, we can often look into that and support you in making sure that never happens to you again. If you don't tell us, we can't do that help. And actually, at first one, if you're scared about telling one, you don't get the help. You put yourself at risk for the second one with lots of implications on. And ultimately, it's not your doctor's telling. A lot of my doctor colleagues are, should I ban this person from driving? No. It's not my job to ban. It's the moment you have two severe hypos, your insurance, your license is invalid.
Okay. Perfect. So I think that's crystal clear. So we've defined type 1, what the regulations are, what the rules are. We've defined the difference with type 2 and the main thing.
Group 1 and group 2.
Sorry, yeah, group 2. I'm thinking type 1, type 2 diabetes now. Yeah, group 2 in the fact that you have to have awareness of hypoglycemia, which is the key thing. And also really importantly, something I didn't know, which you mentioned, which I don't think a lot of people will know is if you go onto insulin with a group 2, you need a month off to show that actually you're okay. So I think those are key points that I'll pull out in the show notes for here. So what I've got now now is a list of questions that were put through to me from our listeners around specific scenarios, and then also from clinicians as well. So the first one is, if I have a hypo while driving, do I need to physically get out of the driver's seat, which is like folklore, which has been around for a long time, I think.
So actually, if you look at INF 29194, which is the official leaflet, it does say get out of the driving seat, take the keys out of the ignition. I have nightmares of someone on the M1 feeling hyper, remembering I've got to get out of the driving seat and wandering around in a lane. I really I'm pushing hard to get that change. And I think what I'll say is what you don't want to be is in charge of a vehicle. I don't think if you were hyper, you pulled over, you turned the vehicle off, no one's going to come and said you were in the driver's seat and charge you or make some comment for you, right? So I think the bottom line is you need to be not in charge of the vehicle. You need to stop the vehicle, turn it off, because what you want to avoid is, in that scenario, people make there's descriptions of what we call automated behavior, where you're not quite thinking confusing, you just carry on doing something, right? So to avoid you mistakenly in a very low glucose reading, deciding that actually what I need to do is drive home, that's what that line is built on. I think taking the key out until you feel better is probably safe enough.
Yeah. So it's in there in the literature, likely to be actually applied in reality.
I'm trying to remove it. Yeah.
We want to get it removed, so it's not an ambiguity in there, especially for the people who are detail oriented. Perfect. We already answered this one. So how long after treating a hypo must I wait before I can drive again? Just a clear distinction between treating above 5, then 45 minutes. So it is quite a big time discrepancy. So that really makes sense to be, if you know you've got a car journey coming up, be checking an hour, half an hour before on the lead-in, so you don't end up in that situation in the first place, especially if you need to get somewhere quickly. Can I rely solely on my CGM to prove I was above 5 to drive?
Lead at the moment, you can use your CGM and rely on that for your Group 1 license, not for your Group 2 license.
Okay, so that's a key distinction. Group 1, yes, but not for Group 2.
The Group 2 rulings, so for the last 2 years now, we've been in the process of recommending that CGM be allowed for Group 2 driving as well. It's accurate enough, making the case. It's been out to multiple stakeholders. They've come back. Most stakeholders were in agreement. Some stakeholders were not. You might guess who those might be. And we've answered all those questions. So it's now in the process of being allowed for Group 2 also, which will make life, because and a lot of the Group 2 drivers I look at, even though they might have type 2 diabetes, actually use CGM to keep their glucose high. So I think that's a positive move for that.
So just to be clear, at the moment, Group 2, you can't use your CGM above 5 to drive, but it's looking to be changed. Group 1, you can. And I know because when the bit of what you asked me to do for the group was, with these new CGMs, specifically these non-adjunctive CGMs, if the CGM value is above 5, what is the chance of being below 3? Because what you've described to me quite clearly is, well, we know people without diabetes run around with a glucose of 3.1, absolutely fine. You only get neuroglycopenic and make bad decisions below 2.8, really. So what's the chance of the CGM being above 5 and the actual capillary glucose level being below 3 on these new CGMs? And the risk is so small. When we looked at the numbers, it was like 0.1, 0.2% at the most risk, which is, again,
below
it's massively. So I think I'm confident, I'm hopeful as you are, that once the new guidelines come out for Group 2, that CGM will be allowed. But just for the listeners, for the time being, if you're Group 2, it is the finger prick you still require for proof that you were above 5.
And something we're just working out, we've got a meeting coming up, is kind of we're just figuring out the guidance. So we all know that sensors sometimes read really off, right? And I'm waiting for confirmation, but you might argue, you said, is it okay to run on my CGM? Now, if your CGM says that you're 2 or 3, but you feel I'm fine, and you do finger prick and it's 5, what's the legal story then? That's, in my opinion, you actually revert back to, you're proving that you're fit to drive using one of the 2 methodologies, and that's fine. I think but I think that would, at the moment, it's not clear in the legal rules about which, and that's the hard part. On the face of it, it's easy, yeah, let CGM for drive, but then you have to start figuring out what level of CGM hypoglycemia are you going to tolerate, and what to do when you got CGM says one thing and finger prick says the other. Which one do you
Because this was the other thing that we
support?
had within the group, wasn't it? Is we know sometimes CGM takes a little while to catch up. So for giving the example, your CGM tells you at 3.5, you make sure you treat the hypo, but your CGM's not coming above 5 yet, and you know it's above 5. You do your finger prick and it's 6. Therefore, you start the 45 minutes from your finger prick rather than waiting for the CGM. So I think as long as it's explained clearly, I think people really understand that if push comes to shove, the capillary glucose would be the one that would be gold standard. But you have the option to go between the two, depending on, kind of what the situation is.
And I think it's a really important point. I think we should really recommend. So one of the things that's happened is with people using CGM so much now, a lot of people don't even have a meter anywhere close. If your sensor's reading C numbers, if you knock it off against the door frame, how are you going to prove you're safe to drive home?
You've got to have a way of testing.
You've got to have just like you have a spare tire in your car, have a meter that's safe there, that's stored there, that's got a backup. That's your backup, so you're not left high and dry somewhere. If your CGM dies, runs out, gets knocked off, that's a really important. In your little safety kit in your car where you've got your glucose, that's where you need your CGM.
Yeah, and another thing on that as well, I'll link to the NHSE guidance on blood glucose meters. There are blood glucose meters of high quality that meet the highest standards and those that don't necessarily do. I think certainly for Group 2 drivers especially, it's important to make sure you've got one of those. So I'll put a link in the show notes to make sure you can check that your meter is of the highest standard. Cool.
And again, about the meter, before I forget.
Yes.
The other thing is, it's actually in the leaflet. It says that it's the driver's responsibility to make sure the meter has the right date and time. And where that makes a big difference is when the clocks change. And I'm aware of a case actually with a lorry driver who was driving along, went hypoglycemic, and I think there was a car in a traffic jam, and he hit a car and pushed that car under a lorry in front and decapitated a woman. Now, he was able to prove that he'd followed all the regulations, that he'd had a finger prick in his meter with the right date and time that proved that he'd met the legal requirements before setting off.
Mm-hmm.
And then that was a big factor in that case. Imagine that. I saw someone recently, I was doing their review, and the meter was kind of some date in the future, 2027, with a month. And I said, if that was that person, how can I prove that you'd actually done what the law says you need to do? So
I'm about to embarrass myself here now. My mind says it's now 1:15 in the morning, and God knows what time and date that is. So that's like me, and mine is way off. So that's actually such an important point, because for example, I knocked my CGM off and I did my finger prick and it's completely fine. I wouldn't be able to prove it because the time and date are wrong. That's actually a real key point. Perfect. Oh, I think that covers the most. The only one question, it's a really tricky question actually, is do the CGM trend arrows count when it comes to matters of legality?
Very simple answer, no.
And I think that's really important, because to try and keep, this is one thing I know when we was in the group, and there's a lot of discussion on, because it gets so messy when you start, well, if it was doing this and this, but the bottom line is, I've already shown you, just as I just described, if you're above 5 on the CGM, the chances of being below 3, regardless of the arrows, is like less than 0.5%. So obviously you want to take common sense that if you're 5.1 and trending down, make the right decision, obviously, but in terms of legality perspective, it's 5 to drive regardless of arrows.
Correct. And actually, for people using CGM, you could argue that the level of requirement is slightly higher, because with a finger prick, you check once before you start, right? And then it doesn't really matter what happens in the next 2 hours. That's what helped that lorry driver. That person went low after, but he proved, look, I followed the rules, right? Mm-hmm. With a CGM, if that CGM had beeped that he was low, so actually your risk of going low is much lower, because you're going to stop if you find out. But the probability of being impacted by hypoglycemia is, it's going to be more, what's the word? You're going to get more annoyance that you're below 4, but you're going to be safer because of that.
Yeah. And I think it's also just, this isn't in the guidance, by the way, but a common sense approach is, if you're going for a long drive, set your low limit at 5. It just makes complete sense, because then you can take action before you go low. Most people don't have the alarm at 5 because it's annoying, but if you're going on a long drive, it's really worth doing that for sure. So they're all the questions from the people with diabetes. We've also quite a few questions from clinicians,
Okay.
which I thought was interesting. So when a person presents with a recent, well, they're coming in for a check for, say, a Group 2 driver, what sort of data are you going to be reviewing over what time period, and what should I be looking at to help me assess whether this person has hypoglycemia awareness so I can say yes to this Group 2 license?
So Group 2 license, there's 3 levels of assessment, right? You have to self-declare that you have awareness, that you check the glucose, you know the rules. Then there was a second level, which was from your local doctor. And that was because that person knows you and knows your other conditions. That's now been pulled out, actually,
Okay.
right? And so it goes self-declaration straight to an independent assessor.
Okay. And
Right.
that's to say someone like you, for example?
That would be, yeah. So there's about 35 people dotted around the country who do these Group 2 assessments. We assess everyone every year.
Mhm.
And so
And so how do you get on that? Because I'm sure there's some doctors who may be interested in joining that panel. How do you get on that?
I think the DVLA put out, when they put out some calls, do you want to be part of this? And that's how I applied.
Okay.
Yeah, that's how I applied. So I was on the panel as an independent assessor for a number of years. Then I was an assessor. Then I got onto the panel, and then eventually I became chair, took over from Mark Evans from Cambridge.
Okay.
So yeah, so these are the doctors out there, and we assess people, and kind of, as I said, we assess people in those 3 levels. Do they check enough? Do they follow what's their risk of hypo, and do they follow the rules? So, but if you're just a clinician who's just seeing someone and you want to making an adjustment, again, for type 1, I think you want to reiterate to them the rules that they need to follow. Ultimately, it's their responsibility to follow the rules.
Self-declaration. Yep.
Yeah, it's ultimately my responsibility is to let you know what the rules are. Your responsibility is to follow the rules as a person with diabetes. And then for awareness, I think the commonest used tool is one of the Gold or Clark scores.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to make the point, actually, I've just done 2 pieces of work, one in the UK audit data, one in the French audit data. And we still find that these questions, so just for those listeners who might not have heard this, the Gold questionnaire was invented in 94, really, a long time ago. And it asks a very simple question. How aware are you of the onset of hypoglycemia? 1 being always and 7 being never.
And what score is what's the score like deemed as an awareness?
So if you're scoring 1 or 2, saying that actually most of the time I'm low, I can feel it, then you've got good awareness. 3 and 4 is a bit impaired or intermediate in awareness. If you're scoring 5, 6, or 7, that you've lost most of your warning signs. And I would say, now, if you only really get symptoms when you're down in the 2s, that's kind of towards that 5 or 6
Mm-hmm.
level. If you never get any symptoms, some people say, yeah, I can be 1.2 and not have any symptoms. That's a Gold score of 7. There's another questionnaire called Clark, which is a little bit more detailed. It asks you 7 or 8 questions. It asks you, have you had any severe hypos? How many times do you have hypoglycemia in a week? Yeah, and so both those scores in large data sets correlate to people with a high risk with severe hypoglycemia. Interestingly, time below range doesn't, unless it's associated with impaired awareness. Again, the time below range, under 5 or 6, 7. If you've got like 25% time below range, you're spending. Yeah. That's a different story.
But I think that's really important, actually, a good clarification, because some clinicians just in general will be thinking, oh, someone's awareness, let's have a look at the percentage time below range, but really you need to ask the specific questions, either the Clark or the Gold score, just to really get that feel of their specific subjectiveness of it.
And what's also important is for people living with diabetes, when you're driving, that, it's not some degree of hypoglycemia is inevitable with instituted diabetes, and it's allowed. And if you look at the regulations, what they're asking us to check is, hey, it's okay if this person has had a few hypos, but if they have a hypo, do they follow the rules? So if I'm reviewing someone and I see a reading of 3.2, what I'm expecting to see is 15 minutes later another reading confirming that your sugar's better.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Are you kind of following those guidelines? Because if you're not doing that, then you might not do it in the heat of the moment, right?
So just so I can summarize what I think you've heard is, so from a clinician's perspective, just in general, looking at Group 1, people coming in who are on insulin, First of all, is to know the actual rules themselves, which we discussed again. 5 to drive, between 4 and 5, take a snack, less than 4, treat the hypo, above 5, wait 45 minutes. Be able to explain that nice and clearly. That with group 1, you can use CGM for that, which is great. So, and then you have to check every 2 hours. As long as you've got a reading within the 2 hours before driving, that's good. But ideally, check before and then certainly every 2 hours. And maybe as a little bonus, it's worth a suggestion for long time driving. Maybe set that lower limit at 5, or that's not in the stipulations. Yeah, they're 5 at 5. So that needs to tell them that. They also need to tell them it's their importance for them to self-declare if they have too severe hypos or not. It's not their responsibility. It's the person's independent. Hopefully that's going to allow people with diabetes and the clinicians to be a bit more open about severe hypoglycemia, so people can actually get the help that they need with the technologies, etc. And then finally, obviously, if someone's having a group 2 assessment, that needs to be done by one of the independent assessors, which sounds like there's 35 of those. That will be handled by them, and they have their own specific assessment. So it's important if someone's going to be getting a HGV, you need to tell them that they need to apply for that. They will need, if they're going on to insulin, 1 month without driving, which could have implications for their work. And then again, important for that. So I think, does that cover most of what that said there? And I think that also reiterates for the people with diabetes who are on insulin, kind of what we're looking at. So, last few questions that I wanted to ask just around a couple of things that you mentioned. One, there's a potential of an update coming to Group 2 where maybe CGM will be allowed. What's the kind of time frames are you thinking for that?
So I think so. It's clear that that recommendation from the panel that I chair. So again, I'm the chair of the advisory panel for the
Not
DVLA.
the whole thing.
The DVLA have their own doctors who ultimately listen to what we've said. And the main issue there has been that the law says it has to be blood glucose. And so there's a legal challenge that what you're measuring is interstitial glucose, not blood glucose. So actually it has to change the law, right? And then we also have to figure out, we have to change all the information leaflets because everyone won't be using CGM. We have to figure out how you switch from one to the other and how you so there's a piece of work now that will happen that will look at that paperwork and those leaflets and make sure the information addresses key areas and questions that might come up with. Yeah, I'm hopeful it will happen in 2026. It's been delayed by at least a year. And there's some other things in the background that the DVLA is implementing some changes in the way the license is happening that will make it faster and quicker. And so it's the delays allowing it to tie in with that and avoid 2 large pieces of work and combine. So there's a bit happening in the DVLA as well there.
Yeah, and I think another thing is probably this is more my interest and my nerdiness, and something that we've discussed sort of offline before is obviously CGM is fantastic and a great tool, and because of that, and it's now market leading and everyone's going for it, there's now new and faster product developments, which is great, but also comes at the risk of products coming to market without necessarily the robustness of testing of CGMs. Does that cause you any concern?
I think it is. So there are kind of 2 or 3 market leaders who are the widely used CGMs, but if you look into the pipeline, John, you and I will know that there's so many products in development. My father in India says, why you want to spend so much money on CGM? There's this watch I can get on Amazon that says it can measure glucose and it's available for 25 quid, right? Now, a lot of these devices we know are random number generators, or may not have the accuracy that we would want for driving. And again, how that's policed and managed is tricky. We can't go around checking everyone's meter or CGM. And actually, what you need to be medically qualified or sell in Europe is a CE mark, which is actually the level to get that CE mark is quite low. So you have a lot of products getting CE mark that aren't really accurate enough.
Yeah,
so I think it's the
Yeah, sorry.
I was going to say it's the responsibility of the person living with diabetes, I think, to try and have an accurate device. I think it's the responsibility of the clinicians to advise people, particularly where driving is a big part of their life, to make sure they're on the right things. And the DVLA will see what we can do within our legal parameters to to make that guidance around what we talked about, sensitive and non-adjunctive license.
Yeah, I mean, that would be the common sense things to me, to get those with non-adjunctive, which means you can make therapy decisions based off the readings. What I will put a plug in is I did a bit of work with the DSM forum where we put together a chart of all the currently available CGM devices. It tells you their accuracy, it tells you how they were assessed, and it's pretty clear. You can look at it and it tells you the ones you can feel confident in and the ones that maybe we don't know the level of accuracy and you may not have the same level of confidence. So I'll point you in the direction of there to go and have a look. And then I think, as Pratik has said there, it's your responsibility to make sure that you're safe, number one, never mind anybody else. So that for me has been really helpful. It certainly laid it out really clearly for me what the numbers are. It's laid it out what the time frames are. It's laid out what's the difference between group 1 and group 2 and what's coming for group 2. We've also I've learned a lot about hypoglycemia and the different levels, and also what that leads to in terms of how impaired your brain is for a certain length of time, which is particularly helpful. And I think hopefully what it will do for people living with type 1 diabetes and also people supporting them is make it clear, so the education's nice and clear for them exactly what they need to do, which will help with the safety. And my hope is the people who are afraid of telling their clinicians about severe hypoglycemia, they actually feel more confident to do so now because they know what the limits are. Therefore, they can get the right help for what they need.
Absolutely. And, just so much of education is word of mouth. And I go back to that point I made earlier, is that, look, if you're driving on the road, you read the highway code and you find out what the rules are. You don't rely on your mate's mate to tell you. And actually, sadly, not all the healthcare professionals are absolutely clear on the rules. So I just put a plug out that please have a look at those rules. If you're not sure about anything, go to the rules and find out what they are, and then you're clear, because a lot of people are misinformed, and practice nurses, even diabetes nurses, might not quite know be up to date with the rules.
Well, certainly within the show notes, I'll summarize what we've said, but put a clear link to where they want to go and read it themselves, because even within the summary, there's a chance I'll make a mistake. There's every chance. So I just want to thank you for your time. You've been very generous. You've given us an hour of your time. Hopefully this message will get out to people with type 1 diabetes and make them feel confident, etc. And certainly I need to call you back for a round 2 at some time about the many things that you deal with, whether it's technology, hypoglycemia, all the other amazing things that you're involved in. So I just want to say a personal thank you as a person with type 1 diabetes and also who works in this space for the amount of work. I remember you telling me how many nights away you spend away from your family doing various things. It's a sacrifice which is certainly appreciated. So thank you very much for your time.
Very kind of you. It's a pleasure to be on, and thanks for putting out the show. I hope people enjoy it, and it gives them some information. Thanks.